Today on RPG Horror Stories, we have a DM who forced a player to be a bad guy because, without further ado, let's get started. Back when this whole COVID thing happened, I had recently lost my job, so I finally had my weekends free to spend with my spouse. Together, we decided that getting an online 5th edition D&D group together on Sundays was a good idea, both to have a scheduled activity and to keep us in touch with friends. After a few rounds of us going out and recruiting, we roped in a friend who had just finished a years-long campaign and steadfastly demanded that, if he plays, he gets to be the GM, because he likes the hot seat. Fine by me. 5e's reliance on stat blocks doesn't work well with my minimum preparation GM style, and it would take a huge planning load off my shoulders if someone else wanted to GM. So, after the rest of the group gathers, the GM lays down a few ground rules. Most importantly, for the point of this story, are the following. 1. That he runs a story-first, low-combat campaign because he considers combat a low-effort, lazy approach to things that only hampers storytelling. To each their own. This is a view he'd expressed to me before, and out of hand dismissed me suggesting alternate games and settings like Dungeon World or 7th Seas. Rule 2. There's only one homebrew rule. The wild magic chart in the book is boring, so anybody that wants to roll a wild magic sorcerer would be rolling on his custom chart with thousands of possibilities instead of only 50. I saw the chart, it is a mess, but ultimately irrelevant to the story. Only the lack of other house rules matters. With these rules in mind and an open rulebook policy, we all disperse to making our characters. We get Elf Rogue, played by my wife, with a charlatan background and a plan to go deeper into archery. A Tabaxi Rogue with a criminal background with no specific plans given to us. A Miklatoast Dwarven Life Cleric and a Worshipper of Bahamut. And me. After bothering the GM for some background details in the world he was running, I proposed to him a lawful good variant, human silver dragon-blooded sorcerer from a neighboring country. Her dragon blood having elevated her family from common merchants, I decided her parents were tailors, into the nobility, and she's on her first quest as a knight-errant after honing her bloodline's powers for 6 years. I'm very clear that I don't want to have her dealing with retainers or pages, so I'd like to be a knight, official title Sir, as was customary in the country, and I guess the privilege of rank background feature, although as a foreigner my character wouldn't be able to use this. I mentioned that mechanically I wanted to dive heavily into the elemental magic side, which is why I dove into Dragon-Blooded and was going to be taking Elemental Adept for my racial human feat, but asked if I could have it consider cold immunity to just be cold resistance. The GM vetoes this immediately, and I acknowledge it. I'll have to pick up some off-element spells later, but the party's starting at level 1, and the only thing he'd reasonably throw at us at level 1 with cold immunity is a baby white dragon. The game opens with my PC stepping off her family's carriage and immediately being disgusted by the mud, filth, and dirt covering her fancy clothes. I interrupt, protesting that my character is a knight from a merchant family seeking out a holy quest. While I dress in fine clothing, I figured they'd be more sturdy and less opulent. The GM tells me to just roll with it, and I relent. The GM guides me to the marketplace with a hint to ask after directions to the local temple of Bahamut. The first person I meet is my wife's PC, who, true to character, immediately tries to scam me and sell me what she describes as a rock painted green that she's trying to pass off as an emerald. I claim to have no interest in the bauble and only the holy quest when the GM interrupts me. No, that's going to be an insight check against wife's deception. Despite me claiming again that my character has no interest in baubles and only wants to do her holy quest, the GM rules that, as a noble, I always want shiny baubles. Dejected, I just roll insight against my wife's deception. Our skill modifiers are actually pretty equal and... Okay, I lose. With a sigh, I pass 2 gold over to my wife's character sheet and scribble obviously fake emerald in my notes. Wife's character, seeing an easy mark, decides to lead me to the Temple of Bahamut. She's a local and thus doesn't have to roll for it, which is fine. It is there at the temple that we encounter the other 2 PCs. Tabaxi is seeking atonement for her crimes, and Dwarf is her minder. A priest is giving a sermon about how there's a holy quest and they're seeking adventurers to take it up. Awesome. Anybody wanting to learn more needs to speak to the temple's lawyer, standing by the sideline and sign a contract. The lawyer describes it as a standard adventuring contract, absolving the temple of any fiscal responsibilities in the event of injury or death. It's also written in Draconic, which my character can read, thanks Dragon-Blooded subclass, and an intelligence check reveals that it also has a language that would force us to at least attempt the quest. Sensing shenanigans, but thinking this would act as a stepping stone to rooting out corruption, my character signs anyway. We're whisked off to a side room where we're told the secret holy quest is being kept a secret because it's a dragon plundering the trade routes, and it's not like they'd get many recruits if people knew they were trying to kill a dragon. Hey, remember when I said the only reasonable cold immune enemy at level 1 was a baby white dragon? So we agree to the quest, because we are legally forced to, and are led outside, at which point my character points out very loudly, so that the assembled crowd can hear, that the temple is illegally and unethically forcing people to fight a dragon. She declares on her, technically non-existent in this country, authority as a knight that these contracts are rendered moot and casts prestidigitation to burn the stacks of contracts. Immediate backspace and complaints from the GM. That doesn't happen, he says, and you can't make it happen. He will later admit that he wasn't even listening to my in-character reasons and assumed I was just being disruptive for disruptive's sake, I guess. The rest of the party filters towards a tavern, where we're to wait for a carriage to take us to the dragon's territory and meet with the other adventuring parties taking up this quest. Hey GM, I ask, is there a chance I can look around to see if there's any survivors of these dragon attacks, or corpses I can examine to figure out what kind of dragon we're up against? GM asks how my character would even know that different types of dragons are a thing, and I point out that my sorcerer, who gets her powers from dragon blood in her veins, gets bonuses to talking to dragons, is covered in dragon scales, speaks dragon, and is trained in arcana, should probably know about different varieties of dragons. I'm allowed an arcana check. Sorcerer then finds a still living victim in a medically induced coma, being tended by a priest of Bahamut. The GM tells me I wake him up, and I respond, "What? No! They're in a medically induced coma for the pain, right?" The GM says yes. "Well then, I don't want to wake him up." I then examine the body, successful persuasion on the priest, to find the wounds that suggest that they came from a magical, cold source, and conjecture that we're dealing with a white or silver dragon. I then give the priest half of the remainder of my gold to make the poor guy's recovery as painless as possible, along with my cloak, with instructions that leftovers from the gold are to help him and his family rebuild, and head back into the market to try and get some potions to increase our resistance to frost. Out of character, I immediately acknowledge that I probably won't find anything I can afford and go back to the tavern in such a case. "Actually, no," the GM says. "There is a merchant that just happens to be selling exactly what you need." The GM immediately roleplays haggling on the price. "Awesome," I say. "I'd like to examine the potions before agreeing to anything. Is that an arcana check or..." "Nope, I'm going to have you roll insight so you can tell me whether or not he's scamming you." "Can I get advantage because I'm good with magic?" "No." And that's how my character got scammed into buying several vials of watered-down wine instead of cold resistance potions, because apparently nobles buy whatever they want at every opportunity. Wisdom isn't even my dump stat. So I make it back to the tavern. There's a few character moments. The dwarf makes fun of the cloak I'm no longer wearing, or own as if I'm still wearing it. And we're introduced to the other adventuring party, all universally described as higher level than us, and includes a wild magic mage. I guess the GM was salty that nobody wanted to engage with his wild magic chart. And a decked out fighter, flushed with cash, and cold resistance potions, and who immediately identifies my cheap wine as cheap wine. GM then spontaneously decides that this NPC is a rival of mine, and he comes from a noble family that has been a rival to mine for generations, despite my character's family being nobles for only 6 years. Oh, and he's actually trained as a knight, and so he's super dangerous. ignoring the fact that my character is also trained as a knight, but just fights with magic instead. It's at this point that I realize the GM doesn't approve of my backstory and just read, "Human noble sorcerer," and filled in the blanks himself. We fast forward to the next morning and are in the carriages leading to the dragon's territory. There's some light character moments and we're made to establish which carriages we're in. I'm forced into the rear one, isolated from the rest of the party with my supposed rival. Some light role-playing before suddenly there's an avalanche and it tumbles between the two carriages, immediately killing the horses and flinging the carriage driver towards the new ledge. "OP, the carriage driver looks dead in your eyes," I interrupt. Okay, I lunge forward to grab him and pull him up. Now, strength is my dump stat, and I fully expect to fail the athletics check, which is proven true when I roll a 9. I, however, did not expect this failed roll to result in not only the carriage driver dying, but myself being pitched over the ledge and now hanging for my own life. The party weighs their options and decides to make use of a tabaxi having a climb speed to climb down and lift me free, not having to make an athletics check by virtue of climb speed. That's where session 1 ends. The GM demands to know what I was thinking, trying to save the NPC. He's just an NPC. I point out that my knight, who had spent the entire session planning ahead and trying to be helpful to everybody and acting charitable, would certainly try to be a hero and save the man from falling to his death, especially in front of a social rival. And then the GM says the words, "You're a wizard. You're not supposed to try and be a hero." There is no session 2. This is a completely different thing than railroading, but it has a similar principle. Railroading DMs want to tell their story, the story of their campaign, despite what players want. DMs like this want a specific story for a character. DMs like this have an idea of what the player character is and what their story will be. It's a more specified version of railroading, and it's really easy for DMs to get into this trap. I encourage DMs to get invested in player characters. That's something that I will always encourage because I think it's important. You as the DM also needs to care about the player characters. However, they're not your characters. They belong to the players. It's the players that are telling their story, the players who are expressing who these characters are. The DM does not control that. For example, in my campaign, a friend of mine who had only played D&D in a one-shot once before joined the game and made a druid. And based on the way she described this druid, I imagined her to kind of be a transcendentalist, if you know what I mean, sort of pulled away from society, quiet, awkward, not a people person. However, she played the character completely different from what I imagined, and you know what, that's okay. Instead, this druid is incredibly outgoing, funny, a little socially awkward, but she doesn't go inward. She's very expressive. She even became very invested in the social and political elements of my world, which again, I was not expecting at all. However, I didn't resist this. I didn't tell the player, "Oh, you need to be a social outcast who doesn't talk to anyone and doesn't get involved in politics," because that would be stupid. The player clearly wants to invest herself in that kind of stuff, and I facilitated that. This DM clearly had a vision for this player's character, an evil, sorcerer, rich person, which is the complete opposite of what the player wanted. I don't understand why this DM hates wizards so much and thinks they're all evil. I don't get that at all, but it also hasn't helped to make this campaign very good, clearly. In short, care and be invested in the characters in your D&D party, but don't control them. If you enjoyed today's episode of RPG Horror Stories, then please do leave a like. If you want to see more episodes of RPG Horror Stories from me, as well as my other series, then please do subscribe to Crispy's Tavern. And finally, if you want to leave your own stories or thoughts, go down to the comments down below. In essence, like, comment, subscribe. I will see you all next time. Farewell.